Good evening and welcome everybody. We thought we would start on time. A little change of pace. So thank you all for coming. My name is Andres Martinez. I'm the editorial director of Future Tense. Future Tense is a project of New America, Arizona State University, and Slate Magazine. We look at how emerging technologies affect society and are designing our future. We put on public events here and in New York, ranging from conversations like we had last week on the Computer Fraud, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. We also do movie nights. We just recently showed Children of Men, hosted by Francis Fukuyama. We have an event coming up in a few weeks on the end of ownership, or how the concept of ownership is changing in our society. You can follow us on Twitter at Future Tense Now. And the hashtag for this evening's program, by the way, is FTVotes. Today's discussion, or this evening's discussion, is both timeless and timely. But we really wanted in this campaign season to step back from the constant chatter about whom we're going to vote for and kind of take a moment to talk about how we vote in this country. I think it struck our Future Tense team as we were thinking about programming the fall that voting remains a surprisingly old-fashioned exercise in America. I'm supposed to reach for my phone now and use a prop and say, you know, with this gadget, I can deposit checks, which I only started doing very recently, and it still feels kind of like it's not really happening, but it's very cool. You know, I can draft a fantasy league football team. There's no end of things I can do, but when it comes to selecting our representatives, I still have to go on a certain Tuesday at certain hours to stand in line, just like generations of Americans did before us. I can recall after the 2000 elections hanging chads. I covered the aftermath of that as an editorial writer, and I went to the first Secretaries of State conference right after that, and there was all this talk about how everything was going to change. We could no longer in this country have elections whose margin of error might exceed a margin of victory. And when you look back, I mean, that was 16 years now. And, you know, take a moment to think how much has really changed. It's kind of striking. On the other hand, when you look at the types of data breaches and other things occurring in more technologically advanced realms, I don't know how to feel about that, the lack of change on the election front. As with so many things in life, what constitutes progress depends on context and where we've been. And I think this is really true when we talk about voting systems and how we feel about them. As an example, when I think about national voting cards and this requirement of a photo ID, having grown up in Mexico, in that context, the institution of a tamper-proof voter ID nationwide by an independent electoral commission was the necessary act to break one-party rule. It was a very empowering moment for democracy in Mexico. And yet, of course, given our history and in our context, we might have very different associations with requiring a national photo ID at the polls. So I think it's instructive to think about how some of this can be relative, and it's hard to make absolute judgments about different systems. So I really am pleased that so many of you came. There's not a debate tonight, so we can think about the process of voting and not necessarily the colorful personalities this time of year. Let me just give you a few housekeeping items. A reminder to please silence your cell phones. When we have Q&As, please wait for a microphone and identify yourself, since this is being webcast. I mentioned our Twitter hashtag of FTVotes. And then after the conversation, we want everybody to go up one floor on these beautiful stairs, and there's going to be cocktails served outside on a terrace on this lovely evening. And the other thing I should mention is these blue marbles. So I saw a lot of you voting. Because we're so tech savvy at Future Tense, this was our voting system. We wanted some fun input from you. on how you would most want to vote in a presidential election. And that will be continuing after the event. So if you haven't voted and you don't lose your marbles, sorry, I couldn't resist. Thank you. I'm here every Tuesday. So to get us in the mood and to give us some deep background on elections as they presently stand, because we're in a DC think tank, we do have to watch a very wonky video that is put together by some of the leading political scientists in this country. It's very short, and then we'll start the program. So.
4 years have passed, it's time again to stage the main event. Election day is drawing near, we'll pick our president. Republicans and Democrats hold national conventions. They build their party platforms to broadcast their intentions. The candidates they nominate will surely have potential. They'll have to campaign long and hard to prove they're presidential. With whistle stops and photo ops and great debates and TV spots, posters, pics, even dirty tricks, they run for president. The key states are the bigger ones with larger populations. They have the electoral votes it takes to win elections. Abe Lincoln, Grant, and FDR, they all got here this way. Be sure your mom and dad get out to vote election day. After whistle stops and photo ops and great debates and TV spots, election day we'll have our say and pick a president. Exercise your vote.
That's the theory. It's so simple, right? So shout out to House of Rock. Now I'd like to introduce Matt Adams, who's going to get us started with a short presentation. I was so delighted when Matt agreed to fly out here from California to be with us. He is the program director at IDEO, one of the nation's leading design firms. And again, we're talking about designing systems. And Matt has worked on a project with LA County that looks at how we vote and how we might actually improve the mechanisms of voting. So Matt, if I could invite you to come up to the stage. Thank you.
All right, it's good to be here. Like I said, my name is Matt Adams. I'm from IDEO, a global design firm that takes a human-centered, design-led approach to solving problems that are helping organizations and companies solve problems. And in this case, what may not have been clear in the intro is that the County of Los Angeles is designing the first, as far as I know, publicly owned voting system in history. And they decided to partner with IDEO to help them do that. You might ask yourself, why would a county come to a design firm to design a voting system? And the reason is that they recognize that at its core, voting is a very human activity. And the needs of the voter should be at the center of any voting system that's designed. So that's kind of where we started. And some of the things that you might want to know about Los Angeles County is that it's very, very big. It's got more than almost 5 million registered voters, which, if you look at the statistics, is more than 42 of the states. Very, very big. Inside of the county, there, as you might imagine, there's a wide variety, wide diversity of voters. Some are better served by the voting system than others. And when they came to us, they had a couple of goals for the new voting system. One is that they wanted to remove the barriers that kept some voters from feeling like they could vote. And two, they wanted to create a system that worked really well now and at their scale, but also a system that would work well in the future, even if regulations change, even if technology changes, or even if people's expectation of technology changes. So when I talk to people about this project, because I've been leading this project for about 2 years, and we just finished and handed over some functional prototypes and a reference design, one of the first things that almost everybody asks me is like, well, why don't we just vote on our phones? And there's actually a lot of reasons why we can't vote on our phones yet, principally because we haven't figured out yet how to vote anonymously and securely over the internet. But it makes you wonder, well, if we can't vote now on our phones, why couldn't we fill out a sample ballot on our phones, for example? Sample ballots are an important part of of the election, of the voting process for a lot of voters, right? Like, voting takes a lot of research and a lot of prep, and sometimes you're not very familiar with what you're voting on. You don't remember what it was that your friend told you that you should vote on, that you trust. And so what people tend to do is they tend to take the paper sample ballot that's mailed to them and they mark it up. And when they go to the polling place, it's really kind of an exercise of transcription. They're copying what they marked in their sample ballot into the official ballot, right? So what if the sample ballot was mobile and it went everywhere that you went? So when you heard about the contest that you want to mark, you can mark it then. And then taking inspiration from the boarding passes that the airlines use, what if you could instantly scan those selections and transfer them onto your voting machine? That would drastically speed up the process of voting. It could result in shorter lines in the polling places. And that's actually a pretty cool thing, right? And that's one of the things that we're doing. When you talk about the voting machine itself, the goal that we set for ourselves was a very high one, is we wanted to create one machine that all voters could use to vote successfully and independently. And that's not really the way it is right now. So what you see up on the screen is a picture of LA County's current voting system. That's what they're going to be using this November. And there's 3 different voting booths, one that most voters use. There's one that's wheelchair accessible, and there's one that's an audio ballot. It's an audio machine, voting machine, that's for basically any other need that is not served by the other 2. And as you might imagine, if you need to use one of those machines, it can feel a little stigmatizing. And you can feel like maybe you're not a first-class citizen. And so what we wanted to do is to make it so that every machine could serve every voter, which is kind of a big challenge. And one of the ways that we figured it out is we needed to work with and understand the needs of all of these voters. So the guy you see on the screen behind me, his name is Ernie. He lost his sight when he was an adult. And around that time, he realized that it was really, really hard to vote, and he stopped voting because it was just so difficult. And he's one of the many people that we worked with as voters and users to test the prototypes that we were creating. So here's an example of one of these moments. We're in the middle of trying to figure out what this voting system is and what an interface could be that works for people who are not sighted. And we came up with an interface that uses a keypad controller, audio narration, and becomes simple and easy for voters who are not sighted to be able to vote. One of my favorite moments in the project was when Ernie was experiencing this prototype, and he said something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact quote, but he basically said, it's like I'm reading the ballot. It's like I can read it. If it were this easy, I think I would start voting again. Which is amazing if you think about it. That's a very powerful thing that you can do through design, through focusing on the voter experience to enfranchise people who don't feel enfranchised. And as we talked through hundreds of voters, actually, we realized that there's a very diverse set of needs, a very diverse set of challenges that make it difficult for people to vote. Many voters have multiple challenges, and they could be language fluency, they could be low literacy, they could be low vision, they could be cognitive difficulties, they could be mobility issues. And some people have multiple of these challenges together. And if you think about it, a lot of us have some of these challenges ourselves to one degree or another. What we found was, as we looked really closely into this and looked at what the needs are of these people of a voting system, we started to see that some of these needs overlapped. And that if we could create a system that had 4 ways to interact with it, we could, well, let me talk through what they are. So one is a touch screen. And if you added to that touch screen audio narration, and if you had, as what we were designing for Ernie, an interface that uses a controller and audio, and the 4th one is if people could use bring their own input devices, then we could create a system. Oh, and that they could set their own accessibility settings, choose a language, you could create a system that works for virtually every voter. And if you integrated the ballot box into the machine, they could cast it in place using those same accessibility settings. The ballot, right now, the state of the art for making sure that a election has integrity is that you have a printed ballot that a voter can verify. So we designed it so that it only shows what you selected, makes it easier to verify. It's printed in the language that you voted in. Vote by mail also we designed to be easy to use and bilingual. Based it on a lot of the great work that the Center for Civic Design has done on designing for elections and making them more usable. So a vote by mail ballot that's more usable, and a voting machine that works for everybody, and this interactive sample ballot that allows you to speed up your voting process, but also allows you to reach people who maybe have accessibility needs on their device that's set up for the way that they use. Makes it so that we're meeting some of these goals that the county laid out for us. So while we can't vote on phones today, in the future, when that becomes possible, I think we've set the foundation so that the county system can evolve to accommodate that. So thank you very much.
Thanks. I'd like to ask our panelists to go ahead and be seated, and I just wanted to pass the baton to our great moderator. Please come up to the stage. Mark Schmidt. Mark is the Director of Studies at New America, and he directs the Political Reform Program here. Although I think Mark's main title should be Fantastic Mentor. He has mentored many generations of people who've come through New America and a lot of journalists in town, as I think a lot of you are well aware. So, Mark, the stage is yours. Thank you.
All right, that phrase, many generations, is going to haunt me. Thank you, Andres. I love that. Anyway, I really appreciate all of you being here. This is a really exciting conversation to have. I think in the political reform program at New America, we often focus on kind of the burdens of the past and limitations on voting rights and issues with campaign finance reform and so forth. And I think it's really great to have a conversation that's just, a kind of a blue sky conversation about what elections can be like, and that we can really hope for more. I think we often try to focus instead of on the idea of corruption, for example. We try to think about what are the barriers to entry to the democratic process and how can we bring them down. We often think of that in terms of what are the barriers to running for office, what are the barriers in terms of organizing and getting people involved. And I think, the barriers to what it is to actually just participate as a citizen and vote are huge and varied. And they're the big ones that we hear about, like voter ID, but there are a lot, and I think Matt's presentation really brought it home sharply. There are a lot that are much more subtle. I mean, design, and we're seeing this in other areas too. We have a lot of work that we're doing right now on design of social policy, and there are a lot of things in our social policy that create huge barriers to people getting the services they need. And I think we can really begin to integrate thinking about design in the way we think about democracy itself. So this will be a pretty free-wheeling discussion. I'll ask some questions. I will cut people off and so forth. But first, let me introduce the panel. You've already met Matt, who's program director at IDEO, and great to have him here. Now I'll go back. Jamel Bowie is the chief political correspondent at Slate and covers the campaigns, elections, national affairs. You've all seen him. I had the privilege of working with Jamel at the very beginning of his career, which is not generations ago, but is beginning to recede a bit into the past. Jeremy Epstein is a senior computer scientist at SRI International. He focuses on cybersecurity challenges facing government and industry, including voting security. Dalio Lithwick, who you probably all know in the same way that you know Jamel, is a journalist at Slate and writes about Constitution, the courts, and the law, and is a lawyer and really important voice on these issues. We were going to be joined by Larry Norden from the Brennan Center for Justice, but I'm not going to introduce him because he's not here. So I'm going to I guess I'll just kind of pose the question for the first thoughts, maybe building on Matt's presentation, and just encourage you to think about, like, without being bound by the Shelby County decision or voter ID or this or that, what do we think elections could look like? And what could we imagine them, that, you know, the 2020 election, the 2028 election, going, whatever it is going forward? And I'll just sit down.
Well, first, thank you to New America for having me for this panel. I also enjoy these blue sky discussions about how our electoral system can work, so I'm excited to chat about it. You know, off the top of my head, I'm very much focused on sort of immediate barriers to voting, and what I think elections will look like in 4 years or in 8 years or in 12 years is simply that there are no barriers to wanting to at least physically go to cast a ballot. Right now, and we saw this in the primaries, we're seeing this right now, there are millions of Americans who are registered, but maybe their registration was purged. There are millions of Americans who want to be registered to vote and have a hard time getting to the facilities necessary to register. There are Americans who are registered to vote, are motivated to vote. Maybe they don't have ID. Maybe they simply don't have someone to physically move them from point A to point B, and that's something that a lot of campaigns do. There's a great deal of campaign infrastructure devoted essentially to physically moving people to the ballot box, but I think that is unnecessary. That is not unnecessary, but we ought to have an election system that makes that superfluous, that you can vote from home, you can vote from school, you can vote from work, you can vote from, and in one way, shape, or form, from wherever you are. Broadly speaking, I think we still have a great deal of distance to cover in terms of having an election system that meets voters where they are. And if we can do that, if we can simply have one that accommodates everyone in this very basic way of simply being able to cast a ballot with as little friction as possible, then I think we would see a great increase in turnout. More people would participate when it's easy, and more people would feel empowered to participate, which is important as well.
Jamel, how do you answer, you know, maybe this might be a really old-fashioned concept, but people used to sort of worry that, like, they used to say, well, Election Day is kind of a civic ritual, and people get together and they, you know, being there physically and participating in the community and bumping into your neighbors is an important value. Right. Is that just like a old concept that's out of date?
Yeah, I don't think it's an old concept. I think there's a lot to say for that kind of civic engagement. There are not that many events or experiences in modern American life where you have these kind of collective rituals. At the same time, I view participation as a greater value than simply this like civic feeling. Well, there aren't that many situations in American life where we have these collective civic rituals. It is the case that most people have their local civic rituals or community civic rituals. There are plenty of opportunities for your typical person to run into someone they know in their lives. I don't think that's necessarily a direct state interest, but I think there is a direct state interest in making sure people have access to the ballot and are able to vote. And if that means there's less of a magical feeling around voting, it doesn't give you a twinkle in your eye anymore, then so be it.
Right. Well, I mean, I was reminded by Matt's presentation, you had the example of a person with social anxiety. There are people for whom that's not necessarily a valuable thing. Dahlia, you've been nodding. Do you want to?
Well, I think I want to amplify something. I'm going to start by saying thank you to New America, and it's a real joy to be here. And I agree, it's nice to be able to sort of talk aspirationally, and rather than going further and further down the well of despair. And I do want to pick up on one thing that I think Andres said at the beginning, which is this is an issue that we only talk about in the months before elections. And and the months after when we're like, Cleveland, what happened? But I think that we do a really bad job in this polity of paying attention to this in years where we don't have a presidential election. But I think I just want to double down on one thing that Jamel says, because I think what I would like to see happen isn't just that we meet voters where they are and we make it easier for people to vote. That's clearly critical. But I think that we have to somehow convince voters that their vote matters. Yes. And I think that what we have lost and we are eroding with every day, it seems, is voter confidence in the system, and that can take all sorts of different forms. That can take the, Citizens United form, anguish and despair, it's all bought and sold, why should I vote? It can take the, gerrymandering conversation and, why bother? There's so many iterations, and they're not all implausible for why people shouldn't bother voting even if they could do it on their phone because the fix is in. And the more, this is a one-way ratchet, the more we all use the language of it's rigged, the fix is in, the primaries were fixed, the more there's this aggregate effect on the voter who says there's just no point, even if I could vote by blinking twice, it's too hard for me to do it if I don't believe it. And so I think I would compound what Jamel is saying with the absolute urgent need to restore confidence. And empirically, I think it's true, gerrymandering and Citizens United notwithstanding, the system works okay, considering it's a patchwork of insanity, run by partisan workers at the state level who have no training. We do okay, and yet the public perception is that it's a sham, and that's a bigger worry even than access.
And of course, the sham goes beyond just what happens in the election. I mean, lately I've been feeling like, there is this interesting mystery, like why are Hillary Clinton's corruption numbers so high and untrustworthy? Well, it's partly because we've been telling people the whole system's corrupt for a long time. People believe it, and it's really hard to, to create any sense of trust around people who've been part of the system. But Jeremy, I know you wanted to intervene, and I want to just press you a little bit because I think obviously security is going to raise a lot of other questions, particularly if there's some different kinds of questions about security in this election. Is this going to be a whole other level of mistrust?
Before I talk about that, and thank you also to New America and to Slate for the opportunity to be here, I wanted to first mention that we talk about the voters, but we also need to talk about the poll workers. I had an opportunity about 10 years ago to give a guest lecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and I asked a room full of students, how old do you think the average poll worker is? And finally, one student raised his hand and said, old. And I said, how old? And he said, really old. And I said, how old? And he said, like 35. This is a true story. In fact, the average poll worker is, according to official statistics, 73 years old in the United States. And we need to keep that in mind when we talk about these solutions, because they have to be technologies that an average 73-year-old can put up. I'm 57, so I'm the chief poll worker for precinct 841, Fairfax County, Virginia. Very proud of that, and I encourage everyone else in this room to volunteer to be poll workers, because we can't run an election without poll workers. Very important thing to do. I'm the young guy. I get to post all the signs because I'm only 57. But I drive the average down. But I think it's important to recognize that, yes, it's important to make it easier for people to vote, but we also know that adding internet voting does not increase voter turnout. We all want it to. We believe it should. We desperately want it to, but it doesn't. The hard facts are that with the exception of Estonia, where after 10 years there was an increase in voter turnout, it doesn't solve the problem. We're creatures of habit. We either vote or we don't vote. All internet voting does is it makes it easier to corrupt the election by hacking the systems. I love the idea of pre-selecting votes on my phone and then going in and scanning. I am worried about voter coercion because I can have somebody that I want to coerce. I punch the stuff in and say go into the polls. So I don't think we should say this is a panacea. We need to recognize that all of these things have social risks as well as technical risks.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to me when I look at some of the data, like the states that have adopted vote by mail. There's a little bit of a boost in turnout, but not a lot. And we really have a funny, there are high turnout cultures and low turnout cultures, and they don't change all that much. But I also like some of these things. Like there's a case for removing the barriers, even if they don't necessarily produce that measurable increase in turnout. But do you worry that confidence will be even lower as we move towards, once people know about just the exist. I mean, I got a little lesson from the people at OSCT who are trying to develop this open source election system. But what was really interesting is really interesting system, but just to be reminded how many different layers there are of the existing system and how many different points of vulnerability that creates and how old some of them are. And of course, if you've ever dealt with any kind of government technology procurement, it's a messy system. I mean, I feel like maybe we know more now, and it's.
I think we're starting to pay more attention to the breadth of systems that make up what we call an election. We all are familiar with the voting machines in our precinct, whether they're these great new things that IDEO is helping design, or the 30-year-old stuff that we frequently have today. But there's a lot more to it. There's these things we call election management systems. Those are the things that configure the elections, what they call programming the elections, not programming in the software sense, but programming in the sense of setting up the elections. There are electronic poll books that check us in. There are voter registration systems. There are the tally systems, which are frequently the same as the election management systems. All of these systems are large, complex things that are very different from one county to another, from one state to another. In many cases, while there's standards for the voting machines, there's not standards for most of this other stuff. Every state makes their own decision of how they want to roll and who they want to buy from and so on. So there's a lot of variation. Yes, I'm worried about the security risks, but I'm also, I mean, it's something I've been saying for 12 years now. I've been working in this field for 12 years, and I've been saying, yeah, all these bad things can happen. But I don't want to alarm people and say, oh, the sky is falling. It worries me that it's become a hyper-partisan issue this year, where people like me and other technical folks have been talking about it for a decade or more. It is a security risk, but I don't want people to say, oh, I'm not going to vote because the election is rigged.
I love the idea about poll workers. It really is important to volunteer to do that. My colleague who's from Brazil told me today that in Brazil, poll working is like jury duty, like you're called to do it. I have jury duty tomorrow, so I think that, you know, I definitely do that, and I don't do the poll working.
Well,
so
in fact, in Virginia, as the chief poll worker for my precinct, if I'm short and you walk into the polls, I can draft you and say, you're my new poll worker. I've never done that.
Okay, all right. That's a power you have?
That's a power I have.
I don't know if others want to intervene on that question. I'm interested in kind of connecting that to some of the issues about just how voters get information.
Right.
And maybe, Matt, you can join that also, because we tend to think of like the information as coming from things like debates and ads. And is there more that we can do with, in California, obviously the voter guide tends to be like a pretty popular thing. I don't know if there's more that we can do to make sure that people are getting actually useful information that they can use in order to think about how they vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because there's no shortage of sources of information. I think the big challenge that a lot of people have is knowing what to trust, and knowing how the things that they're voting on really apply to them. In California, we have a ballot initiative like measure process where things can go directly to the voters. One of the big challenges is you can have a ballot with many, many measures, and sometimes the arguments for no and the arguments for yes are really hard to pull apart, or sometimes you have two measures that are talking about the same thing, and you don't understand where they're coming from. So there's a lot of activity that I've seen of startups and apps and services of fact-checking and that's trying to attack this problem. And I think that one of the big issues is just knowing how do you trust what you're getting at on the one side, and the other side is like, how does this really relate to me? What impact does it have on my life, and how do I evaluate whether or not what I'm voting on is something that's good for me or not?
One thing that I think is underappreciated in just sort of this question of how do voters know what is correct information, what is accurate information, is the degree to which political parties really play an integral role here, right? That one of the things that the Democratic and Republican parties do around this time is basically spam citizens with sort of, here's where you vote, and here's how you vote, and here are sample ballots, and here's, if you are a Democrat, here's how you should vote, if you're a Republican, here's how you should vote. And while Americans are allergic to the idea of party affiliation, they like the idea of being independent. Even if 95% of Americans vote for one party over another, they like to tell themselves that they're really deciding on issues. Like Jeffersonian citizens. It is the case that parties play this valuable role, and I don't know. And this sort of gets back to Dahlia's point about declining trust in elections, declining trust in our politics. I don't know how we convince people that, in fact, it is a good thing to participate in a political party, that it's not a sign of your lack of independence by participating in a political party. Because I do think that when we're thinking about how to increase participation, how to improve elections, political parties, which are how Americans engage with democracy, it is no accident that as soon as elections got started in this country, political parties formed up. How we can, frankly, strengthen political parties and make them a site for democratic engagement again. And I don't think one has to be a partisan in any way to see just the practical value in having strong and vibrant and engaging political parties. But again, Americans are increasingly disdainful of the idea that one would participate fully in a political party.
And I might add, just again, to draw that out a little. To draw that out a little bit, is that I think we haven't yet reckoned with the amount of institutional distrust across the board that is inflecting on this election. We're still fighting. The last election, we still think like the Koch brothers' money is what drives this, and that's clearly an old template. And I think that it's not just that we don't trust the parties anymore. It's not just that we think the mainstream media, or should I call it the lamestream media, are all a bunch of liars. And we've bubbled ourselves off into two bubbles of entities that don't connect to each other. But ironically, there are things that the federal government could also put into practice that the states could accept help and say, okay, it's not like no one's thought about this, but the states don't trust the feds to help. And so I just think that this distrust, it spans institutions and it goes so deep that it's sort of hard to say where folks who don't believe in any institutions are going to find institutional fixes.
And this I think is before you get into questions of how, frankly, how racial and religious and ethnic divisions in the country play into trust about elections. One of the interesting things of the last couple years, 7 or 8 years, is how the hysteria over voter fraud in this country is conveniently associated with the fact that we have an African-American president who won his election on the basis of an unprecedented number of votes from blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans. Maybe that's a crazy coincidence that a lot of Americans think elections are rigged after we elected a black guy. But I think it has a lot to do with a long-standing suspicion of minority voting. And so if you go to many Americans and say to you, I want to make voting easier, I want to make it more accessible, I want to make it more open, they're going to look at a community across the tracks, the train tracks, and say, I don't know if I want those people voting. I don't know if I want them participating. And the tough thing about these issues is that they are tied up so much with political divides that cut to the core of this country's critical disputes.
Well, couple things I want to surface from here, because first, I want to recommend Zach Roth's recent book called The Great Suppression, which really draws out the way in which there's a really explicit language of who we think shouldn't vote that has a long history in this country. But I'm also, I'm with you, Jamel, on the importance of political parties, and I think that's an emerging, in the time that I've been involved in these issues, that's kind of a recent recognition that this is how people organize their political brains. They're not necessarily mapping out issues and like where you take one of those little quizzes and find your position on issues and it tells you who to vote for. Political parties are hugely important. But when the parties are so aligned along racial, increasingly regional lines, I think we're going to see them along age lines, but when they're so rigidly locked down, like there's no, there's a point in, if I go back like 40 years, I could have been a Republican. Not necessarily. I'm not one now. I'm not here in that. But now, some of those things would be almost impossible to imagine. It's impossible to imagine most people who are Democrats becoming Republicans and vice versa, although that did happen more in the past. And and people split their tickets dramatically during that transitional time. We're not in that time anymore. And we're so locked down. It worries me that we maybe, the idea parties don't necessarily work as well when there are only two of them and they're completely inflexible.
Yeah.
And that's why, of course, it would be foolish to vote for Jill Stein or Gary Johnson, given that. But it makes me wonder, are there other innovations like ranked choice voting and things like that that could help other parties emerge and have a voice in the system? I've always been a fan of like fusion voting, where parties can endorse across, like a party like the Working Families Party in New York could endorse some Democrats and not others, and some Republicans occasionally. I like that idea. I think it's great to have this panel because I worry about the complexity of that and people who might be left behind by an even more complex ballot. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts on that kind of thing. Jeremy.
So I'm not thinking of it from the political perspective, but from the technical perspective about some of these voting alternatives. And I love the idea conceptually of ranked choice voting and some of these others, but they're really hard for people to understand. There was an experiment that was done by my friends at Civic Design, Whitney Quisenberry and Dana Chazelle, and they offered a ranked choice voting ballot, and they got people off the street, and they also brought it to a conference of technical experts on voting, and they had us do various things and explain what we were doing and whatever. And it turned out that among the technical experts in voting, only one of us was actually able to explain how ranked choice voting worked. That was Joe Hall, who's now the chief technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology, amusingly enough. But people just don't understand this. And it's not just that the voters don't understand it, it's that it's hard to implement correctly from a technical perspective. It turns out that I can't remember which race in New York, maybe it was a school board race or something like that, that was by law used ranked choice voting. And it turned out after about 10 years of using this, someone actually looked at the software and looked at the law and discovered they didn't match. And that in fact, it was possible that the wrong person had wrong from a legal perspective, had in fact been serving in office because the software didn't match the law. It's really hard to write a law that expresses an algorithm precisely. And if the law isn't written precisely, then the software developers have to figure out how to interpret it. So this seems like kind of an obviously simple thing to, oh yeah, I want ranked choice voting. I'll buy one of those along with a can of soup and some bananas. But it's really hard to get it right. You look at some of the more complex systems, like what they have in Australia, where they have above-the-line votes and below-the-line votes. And Vanessa Teague from the University of Melbourne has tried to explain this to me about 10 times, and I still don't understand how they vote, but they do somehow. And there's a lot of these variations. They aren't always better.
And maybe one coda to that, which is I was just reading about in North Carolina, where there's now dispute about straight ticket voting. And the real question about doing away with straight ticket voting is that it will add more time, longer lines.
Right.
And so it seems like anything that you do that adds complexity also adds time. And if you think about the fact that voters who stand in line for 3 hours won't vote next time, there's a huge cost to making it more complicated.
Those voters who are standing in line for 3 or 4 hours are disproportionately African American, they're Latino, they're low income.
Keep in mind, incidentally, that straight ticket voting doesn't mean what a lot of people think it does. In some states, like in Texas, I think I'm getting the state right, if you mark the straight ticket, say Democrat, and then you also voted for Barack Obama, that canceled your vote. What you might think is a reinforcement is actually a cancellation.
Overvote.
And it becomes an overvote. Yeah. And it's not one that's detected by the machine in many cases. So the obvious thing of, yes, we want to allow straight ticket voting doesn't always do what you think because of the way the law is structured and the way the software implements the law.
Well, I grew up in a state that had you actually had to pull the party lever before you could choose any individual in Connecticut, which was considered part of the evil machine. Matt, do you think, from a design viewpoint, do you think that there are ways to make some of these more complex systems more accessible to people, or should you avoid making, should you avoid the algorithm?
No, there definitely are ways. Design ultimately is a practice of it's reconciling differing constraints, right? And if there is an approach that is important, that has a benefit, then yeah, you can take a design approach to making it more usable. But one of the things that was going through my mind as we've been talking about all of these themes, from alternate voting models to how do we get people to have to trust the system or to trust the information that they're getting. And one of the things that comes to my mind is like there's a little design hack, at least in my mind, which is that when things get complex and difficult and you're trying to figure out like what will people do, can you come back to first principles about what are the things that people really care about, right? Or what are kind of the basic needs that people have, and how do people address those needs in other spheres? And so like for the topic of trust, one of the things that came to mind is that a lot of times people, and this happens in voting too, right? It's like they don't make the decision themselves. They find out people who they trust that have similar values to them, and they look for advice. Or the other thing is when we talk about parties, right? Like parties, in a lot of cases, are a loose conglomeration of people that have their Venn diagram overlaps a little, but in a lot of ways it doesn't. And if you think about the world, like each one of us is a part of many different groups, right? We align ourselves values to lots of different groups. And how do people out? I would gain inspiration. Like how are people connecting to groups around the world that aren't necessarily their local people that have similar values? What are some of these things that we can bring in to consolidate similarities between people to help drive change that benefits them again? So I don't know, that's a little bit removed from ranked choice voting, but when we talk about these intractable issues, like it's always good to take a step back and realize that it's people, right? It's like the voters are people, the politicians are people. We all have needs, and we're trying to get something done. And if we look at the behaviors that we have and the needs that we have, sometimes that can give us inspiration on what the way forward is.
I felt like that was a very fresh and
Very
interesting
profound,
thought. Maybe too heavy for for after 7 o'clock.
Exactly.
Yeah. Any, Dahlia, what's like the one thing that you would do to,
Well, if my gong that I'm banging here is trust, for me, I really think that this is a place where the courts always get it wrong. I think, with a brief, foray and one person, one vote, Reynolds v. Sims, where they got it right, but
which barely happened.
yeah,
That's
and
really
which almost got
how
undone
oddly that
last
went,
year. But I really think that bracket all the other places where the courts are partisan. I think that these kind of very the language of Shelby County is so pernicious, and I think when the court, there's a reason that the court tries to stay out of voting issues, and it's because they hack it up. And I think that watching partisan courts deciding partisan cases partisanly is just very dispiriting. And so I'm not sure that there's a binary answer to that, but I know that when I kind of measure what worries me about a lack of confidence, it's a feeling that not only is the fix in, but that the courts have a thumb on the scale for the rich guy, and I think that that's done just untold damage that we're only starting to see now.
So do you think that if we had, a reversal of the jurisprudence in Shelby County, as well as a reversal of the jurisprudence, I mean, you have to go back, not just Citizens United, you have to go all the way back to Buckley-Vallejo at least. And I'm not sure, I have my doubts about whether that would be very effective, but do you think that you get those two pieces and you would slowly rebuild confidence?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, and it's been one of the sort of, watching, to the extent that there's a talking point about the courts, it's that we're going to reverse Citizens United, and that just doesn't, you can't just appoint a justice and make her reverse Citizens United on her first day in office. But more pointedly, I think you have to unspool decades. And so I don't think it's an easy fix, but I think that the cost has been immeasurable in terms of how Americans now think of the role that courts play in making the system rigged.
And although, of course, you could also talk about certain solutions, like if you talk about a constitutional amendment,
Right.
you're actually kind of deepening mistrust, right?
Right.
Because if you say you can't do anything until you do this actually impossible thing,
Right.
that's a pretty big.
I think some of this has to do as well with just the seeming lack of responsiveness with regards to the legislature, right? I mean, I know liberals for the past 7 or 8 years have talked quite a bit about how the filibuster and counter-majoritarianism in the Senate makes it difficult for voters to figure out who is responsible for what, and also obscures the source of gridlock. And so it's easy for voters to get despairing, and when I'm thinking about this election in particular, and coming up here, I told myself, Jamel, do not say the words Donald Trump. Don't let them come out of your mouth. But alas, we're here, and I have to say it. But when I'm thinking about sort of the forces behind the rise of Donald Trump, I think one of the underappreciated elements is the extent to which Republican voters are just frustrated, not over sort of like the immigrants, but over the fact that for the past couple election cycles, their lawmakers have said, if you elect us, we're going to repeal Obamacare, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And for reasons that are easy to understand, there's a Democratic president, there's a Democratic Senate for much of this time. They didn't happen. And it's difficult for voters to actually understand that why, I gave you the House, I gave you the Senate, so why is it that these things that you're promising me aren't happening? And they're, making government more responsive, or at least making the lines of responsibility clearer, I think could do quite a bit to enhance trust. I mean, I understand why it is that, say, a public option didn't happen in the Affordable Care Act. And so I sort of know who to assign responsibility for that, and it doesn't lead to this generalized mistrust of everyone. But if all you know is that I elected this guy to do this thing and it didn't happen, and he just has excuses for me, then, whatever, it's all corrupt, it's all rigged.
I feel like one of the subtexts here is that elections aren't a freestanding thing. They're kind of intertwined with a lot of other issues of the functioning of democracy. Jeremy, you want to?
This is politics. I stick with the technology.
No, I mean, let's talk. I mean, I want to hear about, what would you think would be an interesting innovation in terms of technology that might increase trust or at least increase security? Or
Well, I think the biggest thing that I worry about this year and going forward is the advent of internet voting. I was, not to imply that this is brand new, but I saw many of you put your marbles in the bin over there that said, I want to vote online. And I would argue that if you put your marble there, you've lost your marbles, because you're gonna lose your vote. It's just in this era where everything is getting hacked under the sun, it's kind of hard for me to argue that cities and counties with very limited budgets are going to be able to successfully do internet voting. People say, if I can bank online, why can't I vote online? Well, the fact is that banks spend billions of dollars securing their systems. Election offices don't. Banks can withstand roughly 1% fraud, not so much on elections. They're just banks don't, as a matter of fact, require that you don't have anonymity of transactions, and votes do need to be anonymous. So I think that's sort of the number one thing that worries me. In Alaska, anybody who wants to can vote online, and I don't have any confidence that they're going to get that right. Thankfully, Alaska only has 3 electoral votes, so maybe it doesn't matter. But in a lot of states, the number of people who can vote online, usually military and overseas voters, that could be the margin of victory. And if someone wanted to manipulate the election, that might be a way to do it. It's certainly the way, if I were a bad guy, I would go there first. The odds of being caught, if you're doing it from an unfriendly country, are a lot lower for internet voting than almost any other way of tampering with the election.
Can I ask one question of Jeremy? My understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason that the powers that be are not afraid of hackers this go round is because the system is so fundamentally chaotic and divided up into, I mean, there's sort of this beauty of our patchwork system, which is that nobody could functionally hack it and make a huge difference, maybe on the margins in a swing state.
Right.
But really, what the best hackers could do is create longer lines, right?
There's certainly opportunity for creating longer lines, making it more people have to cast provisional ballots, things like that. And that's certainly one way to do it. But in states like Alaska, or notably Alaska, the whole thing is at risk. And I worry that what we've seen in the past when people have tried internet-based elections for local elections and also for military and overseas voters, they say, see, no hackers, it must be safe, therefore we should do this for everybody, in just the same way that, see, my bank didn't get hacked today, I guess it's safe for me to, for all times, not understanding that, in fact, the average time from when a hack occurs until it gets discovered, depending on who you ask, FBI typically says 3 to 6 months. I've heard other people say 6 to 9 months. If the election gets hacked and you find out about it 6 months later, it's a little bit late to do something. And this is what very much scares me as we move in that direction. Yes, I think this year we're probably okay because of the chaotic nature. It's just too hard to have a large-scale impact. Local elections are a different story. But in terms of the national election, yeah, I think the chaos probably works to our benefit.
Well, I think there's a screenplay there of that moment where inauguration day they discover the guy. I think we want to go to the audience, and do we have a microphone moving around? Okay. Okay, so when the microphone comes to you, we'll start in the back there. Please, we don't have a ton of time left, so please be as back with the vest. Please be as brief as possible. Say your name and ask a question.
Todd Wiggins, good evening. A quick question: is a possibility that we may coin a new term in reference to any potential debacles that could happen in this election, such as the hanging Chad or wardrobe malfunction or something along those lines? You did mention hacking, so is there anything that you can think of that might potentially become an issue that's unprecedented?
The catchphrase of
Yeah,
December.
I'm not sure what the catchphrase is, but we've been reading in the papers that at least 20 states have noted, according to the Department of Homeland Security, that at least 20 states have had probing attempts on their voter registration systems, and at least 2 states they've been successful. My guess is those numbers are very low. Typically, if you have a professional hacker go after a system, if they don't succeed, it's because they didn't try hard enough. I would imagine that if the folks who are going after voter registration systems are reasonably competent, that they would succeed pretty much 100% of the time. So what I'm wondering is, will there be, if the equivalent of a hanging Chad is, I don't know, a misregistered voter, someone whose address was changed in the voter registration system, and when they go to cast their ballot, they're not there. And it's very hard to tell whether that was because it was hacked or whether it was a deliberate attempt to disenfranchise voters. We've seen a lot of voter roll purging in a lot of states. So there's a lot of potential things that could cause it, and it would be very hard to sort out why it happened.
Okay, you officially cost me my confidence in this election.
I'm sorry.
That's right. Up here in the third row back. That's not right over there.
Hi, my name is Trevor. I was wondering what role you thought the Electoral College played in modern elections, or what role it should play. Do you think that the Electoral College increases voter confidence in the effect that people think that their vote doesn't matter, or what role do you think the Electoral College should play ideally in an election in the 21st century?
I tend to think the Electoral College is one of those things that doesn't really matter all that much until it suddenly does, right? That for most of our elections, it's a pretty even correspondence between who won the popular vote and who won the Electoral College vote. But every so often that doesn't happen, and then it's a disaster. So I tend to think that, ideally, at some point in the future, we have made the Electoral College irrelevant, that we're just voting based on the popular vote, because I do think that the risk that we currently have of these sort of misalignments is just unacceptably high. And I do think that the the idea that, I live in New York and it's a blue state, so like who cares how I vote, or who cares if I vote at all? I do think it's just corrosive to the idea that voting is something that we all participate in, and that the Electoral College, that people know that, yeah, if you live in California, New York, Texas, Utah, that your vote doesn't matter. I think anything we can do to reduce the extent to which people feel that and believe that is a good thing.
It's a relic. Front row.
Hi, I have a question that is in some ways a follow-up on that and something that you had said earlier. So we're about to celebrate a federal holiday for Christopher Columbus, just about as irrelevant as some of the other federal holidays for maybe President's Day, or, arguably. But to the point, why aren't we celebrating a federal holiday for supposedly the most important day of our rights as citizens to vote? And is it not linked in some ways, not to be cynical, but to the Electoral College and to an idea maybe that they don't want everybody on the wrong side of the tracks to vote? Is there a conspiracy behind it in some sense, or is it just it just never happened?
I tend to think, well, I don't tend to think, I know in fact that voting is not just, it's not just technocratic, it's not just sort of, something we all as Americans agree on. It's very much a contentious issue. Who votes, how we vote, to what extent should people have access to voting? And I'd say that the fact that we don't have a national voting holiday, or that we don't vote on weekends, or that we don't have universal early vote or universal weekend voting is a reflection of the fact that these are intensely political issues that go to the heart of what Americans fight over and dispute in our elections. So for example, after North Carolina passed its voting law in 2013, after the Shelby County ruling, North Carolina lawmakers, justifying their decision to slash early and weekend voting, said, well, we're doing this because it's traditional that you vote on a Tuesday. We all find out this year that they did it because these were mechanisms of voting used disproportionately by African American and Latino voters, and they actively sought out information to confirm that fact before they struck those forms of voting. And so that, again, that gets to the fact that that I'm not sure if you can build a political consensus around something like a national voting holiday, in part because, not everyone believes that everyone should have a chance to vote, or have an easy chance to vote. I mean, I just read yesterday some absurd essay about how people should, how government should be run by people who have the correct knowledge, right? There's these broad ideas that exist out there that have deep roots in American thought about who is a deserving voter, or who deserves to have the right to vote, versus who doesn't.
What's that fancy word? What is it? Epistocracy or
It
something?
was some nonsense
Yeah,
word.
yeah, like only. Yeah.
Right.
Can I make just a short comment that Election Day, many of us think of as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November in years divisible by 4, but in fact, it's almost always Election Day. There's at least one Election Day almost every week somewhere in the United States.
Or in California alone.
I mean, I should say that's really important for representation. One of the striking things I've learned in the past couple of years was after the events in Ferguson, when reporters were looking at sort of the political culture in the town, what they found was that this is a town that was 2/3 black. There were no African Americans on the city council, and part of that was because voting was held in April, and that a lot of people didn't know that this is when council elections were held. The people who did know that this is when council elections were held were typically wealthier and better educated and white. And it was very, you talk to people about this in the town, and it became quickly apparent this was a deliberate decision made to keep people from participating, the wrong kinds of people from participating. Wrong kinds. There aren't really wrong kinds of people.
Yeah, so I think this has been a fascinating discussion. It's clear there are both technical questions, but also barriers to participation that we've chosen to create, or that the people in power have chosen to create, and we have to kind of be clear about those. I want to thank all of you for coming. We will have, as Andres said, reception upstairs, and I think all of you will be able to hang around. So the questions you weren't able to ask, you will be able to buttonhole these poor folks and get your right questions. So I really enjoyed the discussion. Really wide range, which I really like.
I want to also I want to thank Mark, and I want to clarify that when I think of generations at New America, I think about 18-month periods because we get, or 2 years, we get so many bright young people who power a place like this, and before going to grad school or something. So I feel like I've lived through many generations, so I felt really bad about that after. I also want to ask, is Larry Norden here? I thought I saw you. Larry from the Brennan Center was going to be with us, and he was late due to another form of American public infrastructure that maybe hasn't kept up with the times, Amtrak. So thanks for your heroic efforts. We're going to get you a drink up on the terrace. And please ask Larry lots of intelligent questions about election reform and elections in the future. So, and we still get to vote. And going to be upstairs. The internet voting is winning, so those of you who are voting for that, before you move to Estonia or Alaska, apparently, please join us for a drink upstairs. Thank you all for coming. Thanks.